Let's turn now to Jeremy White, who is there in Oakland, California. He's a reporter for Politico and co-author of Politico's California Playbook. Jeremy, first, I know you're there at the event. Tell us what that was like. How big is the crowd there, and what stuck out to you about her speech?
Well, they're telling us there are more than 20,000 people here. It's certainly a huge overflow crowd, a lot of excitement for Senator Harris in her hometown. I would say two things stood out to me about this speech. One was its sort of wholesale repudiation of Donald Trump as an overarching theme of Kamala Harris's campaign, more than any one policy area of restoring American values and leadership. And the second was the way that she intentionally opened the speech by weaving her background as a prosecutor in as an advocate for the people. Her role as a prosecutor is something that we're going to be hearing more about. In particular, I think some pushback from more liberal elements in the party about whether they're uneasy with that record. And she really tried to position herself as somebody who is using that role, again, to fight for the people.
And Jeremy, on that note, it appeared just a few minutes into her remarks, there was some kind of audible noise. I don't know if it was a heckler. I'm not sure what it was. And then we heard the crowd sort of attempt to, what it seemed to me to sound like, drown out whatever was taking place. Can you tell us about that? Because it was notable that that disturbance happened right as she delivered this line about law enforcement, saying that law enforcement has responsibility to give people safety and dignity. And at that point, we heard some kind of disturbance.
You know, I couldn't quite hear what people were chanting with that disturbance, too. I also heard the crowd pretty rapidly shout her down. So I can't say for certain whether people were, in fact, heckling her about sort of her law enforcement background. But I think it's fair to say, particularly in Oakland, a city with a long history of activism, you'll see Black Lives Matter posters in every other home here. I think it's fair to say that we are going to hear more about her law enforcement background and folks who are uneasy with the fact that she was a prosecutor.
And can you just give us some context, Jeremy, for people who aren't familiar, what is sort of the substance of some of the criticisms regarding her record as a prosecutor?
You know, there are some feelings that she was too timid in terms of embracing some of the proposed reforms here in California that would have done things like require independent prosecutors to investigate police killings. She defended California's death penalty in court, which is the law of the land. There were some issues with the Attorney General's office when she was in charge having to do with the handling of evidence, and a feeling that she didn't confront those aggressively enough. So, you know, it's going to be a tough line to walk. You don't get elected the top law enforcement official in the nation's most populous state without being tough on crime in some instances. I think you're also going to hear a lot from Kamala Harris's camp about the measures she took to do things like require implicit bias training and move the department in a more progressive direction.
And, you know, we're already, of course, looking at a crowded field here on the Democratic side. You know, this list only continues to grow here as the days and weeks wear on, Jeremy. What, at this point, would seem to set her apart from those who we already know are running or considering running?
Well, you know, I think, for one, she's really captured the imagination of a lot of the liberal base as sort of a young, fresh face of sort of progressivism and of the anti-Trump movement. She's not as much seen as one of these old guard establishment figures. And I think the fact that so far she's the only person of color in the race, particularly a woman of color, is going to be a factor, particularly in primaries in states like South Carolina, where there are large populations of African-American voters.
And we touched on this briefly, but the notion of kicking off the campaign in Oakland, California, we heard her describe very much being a daughter of Oakland, California. Tell us about the significance of having this event there today.
Well, again, Oakland is a city that is a very democratic city and prides itself on political activism and political engagement. And so I think her launching here was a celebration of not just those personal roots, but that sort of political sensibility, which is very much a progressive activist one. And I think that's a mantle you're going to see her embracing.
So, Jeremy, of course, you cover politics in California. How do voters in that state feel about the job that Harris has done so far as a senator on the national stage?
I think there's a lot of pride. I mean, I can't say that I've spoken to every voter here in California, but I think particularly she has a high-profile role on the Senate Judiciary Committee in which she's engaged in questioning of Brett Kavanaugh, of Jeff Sessions, and that's sort of helped to elevate her profile. And she's very much emerged as sort of a forceful opponent of Donald Trump and voice for sort of some yearning in the Democratic Party to both take on the president and move things in a progressive direction. So I think there's a lot of pride in Kamala Harris here in California, for sure.
And on that point, Jeremy, of taking on the Trump administration, let's go ahead and listen to some of what she had to say just a few moments ago.
We are at an inflection point in the history of our world. We are at an inflection point in the history of our nation. We are here because the American dream and our American democracy are under attack and on the line like never before.
So as she continues with her campaign, how much do you think the president is going to be a focus of hers on the campaign trail?
I think that what you heard in this speech is the focus is going to be, even if not on the president per se, on an alternative to what a lot of people see as sort of the mendacity and corruption of the Trump era, and positioning herself as somebody who can return to values of honesty and integrity. You saw her criticizing sort of explicit policies of the Trump administration. She worked in an early jab at what she called his medieval wall, which is not going to work. But I think sort of as an overarching theme beyond particular Trump policies, which I'm sure we will hear about, you are going to see Kamala Harris position herself as somebody who can embrace sort of a different set of ethics and moral standing in the world.
And Jeremy, what is it that you're going to be watching for here in the weeks and months ahead as Senator Harris campaigns?
I think we're going to see if she sort of defines her policy positions. She's going to embrace in the campaign a little more explicitly. Obviously, we're going to be watching to see who comes on as staff, and I'm going to be curious to see what type of fundraising numbers she puts up after this rally. After her launch last weekend, she posted some pretty staggering numbers, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a big surge of donations after this rally as well.
All right, interesting. Jeremy White, thanks very much. Really appreciate your time and insight.
Thanks so much for having me.